Good day, and welcome again to the apocalypse. Start off properly. Namaste. Okay, what I'm going to try and teach you guys is a concept, and that it's kind of deep. So I want you guys to hang with me. And sometimes I tell you guys stories, like I'm going to tell you right now, that don't seem like they have anything to do with science. But it does. Okay, so just kind of hang with me when I tell you this story, and I'm going to tell you the story of Flatland. Okay, so the story goes like this. In Flatland, which is a universe that's completely flat, so Flatland to be something, let's say, okay, let's take this old chalkboard. Flatland is a plane, okay? And the creature, and there are creatures that live in this flat plane universe. Okay, so they could move forward, they could move back, they can move side to side, they can move, but they can't move off of this plane. They're stuck in it. Okay, and now I'm going to switch views, and we're going to envision this chalkboard up here that I had in my house. As the flat universe. So in this plane lives a guy, and this guy's name is Mr. Square. And there's Mr. Square, and Square's got him out, and there he is. Okay, and Mr. Square is living in his plane, and Mr. Square can go forward and back, and he can go side to side, and he can go any combination of that. But he can't go up, or he can't go down. There, in fact, to him, there is no up or down. He can't even think. He can't even imagine an up or down. All right, his entire experience in universe is just flat, in this flat plane like that. And let's, just for purposes of the story, let's envision this plane to be infinite, like space. It goes out in all directions for infinity. So he lives in a completely flat universe, all right? But there is no up and there is no down to it. So it's completely flat. So Mr. Square is living in his flat universe, and he comes home from work, and he lives in his flat house, and it's just four walls like this. So here's his house like that. And he lives in his house, and his house has a door, all right, which can swing shut. So he goes home and he shuts himself in his house, and he's relaxing, and he's got like a window, or something like that in his house. Okay, and so there he is, and Mr. Square is inside his house after a hard day's work, and he's watching his flat screen TV. Did you see what I did there? It's a flat screen. Oh, God, I know you're laughing. I know you are, because that was funny. That was very witty. All right, especially you, Layla Weathers. I know you think that's funny. Anyway, so he's watching his TV and all that. Okay, and then what happens is along comes Mr. Sphere. And Mr. Sphere, he's not a circle, he's a ball. That's what a sphere is, okay? A sphere is a three-dimensional circle. It's a circle that goes in all directions, in three directions like that, okay? And Mr. Sphere he lives in the mythical third dimension, and so he's floating around in his three dimensions, and he comes across and he sees, oh, there's Mr. Square's universe. There's Flatland, and he doesn't know what to make of it. And he looks and he sees all the flat creatures, okay, and they're walking around. So outside the house, here's Mr. Triangle, and here's Mr. Rectangle, and they're hanging out and they're talking to each other and all that. And Mr. Sphere's observing, and he sees Mr. Square inside his house, and he can actually see inside the house. Even though the door is closed. Okay? And so he hovers above Mr. Square and he says, hello, Mr. Square, how are you? And Mr. Square looks around and he's like, wait, who said that? And Mr. Square looks around this way, and he looks around this way, and he's like, he thinks he's going crazy because he hears this voice, but he can't see it because Mr. Sphere is above him in a third dimension. And so Mr. Sphere says, it's me. I'm Mr. Sphere. I'm above you in the third dimension. And Mr. Square says, you're crazy. How can you be in the third dimension? There is no third dimension. And Mr. Sphere says, oh, yes, there is. I'll prove it to you. I'll pass through your flat plane. So let me go to my other prop. Okay, so what Mr. Sphere would do if this was Flatland is, and Mr. Square is in Flatland, so what Mr. Sphere would do is, to prove that he exists, is he's going to pass through the plane like that. Now I can't put him through the chalkboard, but you get the idea. All right, so he's going to pass through the plane. So what does he do? Or what does Mr. Square see when Mr. Sphere passes through the plane? Well, what he sees first is, eraser. What Mr. Square sees first as Mr. Sphere passes through the plane, first he sees a dot. And that's the beginning of Mr. Sphere passing through the plane. And then as Mr. Sphere goes through, he sees the dot kind of flattens out and becomes a line. And then it becomes a bigger line. And then it becomes a bigger line until it reaches the diameter of Mr. Sphere. And then the line gets smaller again as Mr. Sphere goes all the way through. And then eventually it kind of winks out as a dot and then just disappears altogether. So Mr. Square can't see all of Mr. Sphere because he's flat, he's stuck in Flatland, but he can see the part of Mr. Sphere that actually goes through the plane. Okay, so that's what he sees. And then Mr. Square Mr. Sphere says, I'll give you more proof. I'll take you into the third dimension. I should have prepared for this, but I'll wing it. So he goes in and he picks up Mr. Square out of Flatland and he hovers him above in space. So he's got Mr. Square, and we can't see Mr. Square's eye, but he's holding him above this space now. And Mr. Square is absolutely amazed. He's no longer inside of his house, but yet he can see inside of his house. So he's floating above it, and he can see magically inside the four walls, even though the door is closed. He can see inside his room. And he's not sure how this is happening. And he can see outside. There's his buds. There's Mr. Triangle. And there's Mr. Rectangle. And they're talking to each other. And Mr. Square can see them and he can hear. They can't see or hear him because he's above them. He's in another dimension. And he's completely amazed. And not only that, he can see weird stuff too, because he's above them. He can actually see inside their bodies. Like there's Mr. Rectangle's guts, which would kind of be disturbing and gross. But whatever, he can see that. Okay? All right, so he does. And then Mr. Sphere says, okay, I'm going to put you back now. So he goes and puts him back and plop. He puts him back in his house, and Mr. Square is completely amazed at what happened, and he has to go outside, and he opens up his door, and he walks outside, and he's like, sees his friends out there, and he's like, dudes, I was just in the third dimension. And of course, these guys turn around. They're like, dude, you're high. Marijuana is not legal yet in Flatland, kind of like Rhode Island. And he's trying to convince them. He said, no, I could even see inside you. I was floating above you, and I could hear everything you were saying and all that. Okay, but they don't believe him. Okay, and he has a hard time convincing them. All right. So where are we going with this? Well, let me just kind of give you some notes on this, all right? And they kind of go like this. What I'm trying to illustrate to you guys with this is the concept of dimension. Now this you can actually put in your notes, all right? dimension. And I think you guys can see that, all right? And anyway, so what dimension is basically it's a direction of motion. Direction. Okay, so if you lived in a universe that only had one dimension to it, or 1D, that would kind of be boring, because it wouldn't be much of a universe. You would just be a dot, and you could move to the right, or you could move to the left. But you couldn't move up to the top here. You couldn't move this way, or that way, and you certainly couldn't move out or in. It was just right and left, and it would be kind of a boring universe, okay? And creatures in a one-dimensional universe could never get past each other because they couldn't go around each other. They would be constantly just bumping into each other, and that's it. 2 dimensions is what Mr. Square lives in, and 2 dimensions is defined as a plane. Okay, so that's a plane, and a plane is defined as, okay, so a 2-dimensional space where you could have 2 lines that meet each other at 90 degrees, and we use that little kind of square thing to symbolize 90 degrees. Okay, and if you live on a plane, you can move side to side, and you can move up or down. And you can move any combination of those. So you can move like this, or anything like that. But you can't move out of the plane, and you can't move you can't move up, or you can't move down. Okay, so 2 dimensions is just a flat plane. So let me redraw that. There we go, because I need to conserve board space. 3 dimensions, I can't really draw that on the chalkboard all that well because it is 3-dimensional. Really, it requires space. All right. So if 1 dimension is a line, 2 dimensions is a plane, and 3 dimensions is space. Okay, and 3 dimensions is defined as, this is not the best chalkboard here. Okay, so 3 lines, each coming together at 90 degrees. Now again, I can't really draw that, but what we tend to do is we tend to simulate that by drawing like a line that goes this way. Okay, so you have each of these 3 lines hits the other 2 at 90 degrees at the same time. And we see this all the time. Just look at like the corner of your room, and if you look at the corner of your room, you see 3 lines that come together at 90 degrees. So for example, I'm looking at this corner right over here, and actually let me get over here. So I would have 1 line that goes this way, 1 line that hits it at 90 degrees this way, and then the other line that goes up and down hits the other 2 at 90 degrees at the same time. Okay? And that's the concept of dimension. Okay? Why am I telling you this? Well, because this is going to become very important when we talk about the concept of gravity. All right? Why? Because Einstein said that gravity, what it really is, it's a bend in space. And I'll get into that in a bit. Well, actually not in this video, but we'll get a little more into that. That what happens is that when you have a star or something that has mass, what something that has mass really does is it bends the space around it. But if it bends the space around it, where does it bend it? So what a star does is it somehow bends the space around it. And actually, let me use the baseball again as a star. It somehow bends the space around it. But if it bends the space, where does it bend it? Well, it bends it into a 4th dimension because we live in 3. We're like Mr. Square, except in 3 dimensions. All we know are our 3 dimensions. We can't picture a 4th dimension, just like Mr. Square could not picture in his mind a 3rd dimension. Okay. What I want you to do is I'm going to post another video and along with this, and this is shows a simulation of gravity with a guy has like a sheet of cloth, and then he puts a ball in the center of it, and the ball kind of bends the sheet of cloth, and that simulates a star bending the space around it. And you see when you shoot an object by it, the object tries to go straight and bends around it like it's being pulled. Okay, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll probably post another video trying to describe that. Okay, but that'll be enough for now.